The cold surgical table beneath my back felt exactly like it did 23 years ago. It was a specific, biting chill, the kind of cold that seeps through a paper-thin hospital gown and sinks directly into your bones. The smell was the same, too. A sharp, sterile cocktail of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. In the corner of my vision, I could see my mother, Chen Mei, her head bowed over a clipboard, a pen scratching against paper. She was signing the consent forms. Again. The sound was a ghost, an echo from a past I was somehow forced to relive. My fingernails dug into my palms, carving four perfect pale crescents into the soft flesh. The familiar wave of betrayal, a sensation I thought I had buried with my own body in my previous life, crashed over me with the force of an Arctic torrent. It was so potent, so real, that I almost gasped. 23 years of quiet suffering, of gnawing resentment, of a body slowly failing me, all of it came rushing back in a single, gut-wrenching moment. In my first life, I had been 20 years old, naive, and utterly devoted to the woman who raised me. She had come to me with tears in her eyes, her face a mask of practiced despair. She'd told me about a distant relative, a good man with a family whose life was hanging by a thread. He needed a kidney, she'd said, and I was a perfect match. It was a chance to be a hero, to give the gift of life. I was young and healthy. I would be fine with one kidney, she had assured me, parroting the doctor's slick promises. The 50,000 yuan the grateful family was offering was just a bonus, a way to help us get back on our feet, to pay off the debts she always seemed to be accumulating. I believed her. I signed the papers myself, filled with a sense of noble purpose. The anesthesia mask had descended then, a gentle caress promising oblivion. I had welcomed it. I awoke to a searing pain in my side and my mother's beatific smile, a smile that I would later learn was not one of gratitude, but of a successful transaction. The next 23 years were a slow, grinding descent into hell. The money was gone in less than a year, swallowed by her insatiable appetite for mahjong and bad investments. My own health, the vitality she had so cavalierly sold, began to wane. I was always tired, always susceptible to colds and flus that lingered for weeks. By my late 30s, the doctors were using phrases like chronic kidney disease and renal decline. By 40, I was on dialysis, my life tethered to a machine that hummed a monotonous dirge 3 times a week. At 43, I died in a sterile, lonely hospital bed, my remaining kidney having finally given up the ghost. My last coherent thought was of her, of my mother, wondering if she ever felt a single shred of guilt. And then I woke up. Not in the afterlife, but here. Back on this same cold table, the same antiseptic sting in the air, the same lie being signed into existence. The universe, in some cruel or perhaps merciful twist, had sent me back to the nexus of my own destruction. The anesthesia mask, held by a nurse with kind but unseeing eyes, hovered inches from my face. It looked like a monstrous cup, ready to steal my consciousness and with it my future. But this time, I knew what came after. I knew the truth that lay beneath the comforting lies. I knew about the poverty that would cling to me like a shroud. I knew about the sickness that would hollow me out from the inside. I knew about her endless, ruinous gambling debts that my sacrifice would only momentarily pause. And I knew about my own slow, agonizing death from kidney failure, a death she would watch with detached sympathy, never admitting her complicity. An invisible timer began to tick in my head. In 18 hours, if I let this proceed, the surgery would be complete. The buyer, a man I now knew was named Mr. Song, would have my healthy 20-year-old kidney, and my second chance at life would begin its countdown to the same miserable end. A cold rage, clear and sharp as a shard of glass, settled in my heart. 23 years of hindsight. 23 years of replaying every moment, every decision, every lie. It was a bitter education, but it had taught me things she could never imagine. It had taught me about the black market for organs, about the legal loopholes, about the precise nature of her deceit. It had taught me patience. It had taught me strategy. This time, I wasn't the sacrificial lamb. I was the executioner. I was ready to play her game, and I was going to play it better than she ever could. The nurse began to lower the mask. The scent of the anesthetic grew stronger, a sweet chemical promise of surrender. I let a small, tight smile touch my lips. Let's begin. The world seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity as the plastic cup of the anesthesia mask descended toward my face. The nurse's voice was a soothing murmur meant to lull me into compliance. Just a few deep breaths, Linway. It will all be over before you know it. Oh, you have no idea how right you are, I thought, a bitter fire licking at my insides. In my first life, I'd complied. I had taken those deep breaths like an obedient child, trusting in the adults around me, trusting in my mother. This time, my muscles tensed, coiling like a spring. This was the moment, the first domino. With a speed that shocked even myself, I snapped my hand up and grabbed the nurse's wrist, stopping the mask an inch from my nose. Her eyes widened in surprise. Before she could react, I used my other hand to snatch the mask from her grasp and, with a guttural cry that was part rage and part liberation, I hurled it across the operating room. It clattered against a stainless steel tray, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile silence. I sat bolt upright on the table. The sudden movement was so violent that the IV needle, taped carelessly to the back of my hand, tore free. A sharp, stinging pain followed, and a spray of bright red blood arced through the air, spattering the pristine white sheets like a gruesome work of modern art. It was my blood. Blood I was no longer willing to give away. The surgical team froze. Two nurses, a young anesthesiologist and the surgeon himself, Dr. Huang, all stared at me as if I had sprouted a second head. Their composed, professional masks had slipped, revealing confusion and alarm. I withdraw my consent, I announced. My voice didn't shake. It was as firm and cold as the metal table I was sitting on. I let my gaze sweep past the medical staff and lock directly onto my mother, who was standing near the door, her hand still holding the pen, her face a canvas of disbelief. Tell them, Ma, I said, my voice dripping with a sweetness that was more poisonous than any venom. Tell them what this is really about. Tell them how much Mr. Song is paying you for my kidney. Her face, which had been flushed with the thrill of her impending windfall, drained of all color. She looked like a ghost, her skin as white as fresh milk. The consent form slipped from her slack fingers and fluttered to the linoleum floor. Wei Wei, she stammered, taking a hesitant step forward. Her eyes darted toward Dr. Huang, a silent plea for him to control the situation. Wei Wei, you're confused. It's the pre-medication. It can make you say silly things. I laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound that had no place in this temple of healing. Confused? No. For the first time in my life, I think I'm seeing everything perfectly clear. 50,000 yuan. That's what a healthy 20-year-old kidney goes for on the black market, isn't it? The figure was a direct hit. My mother flinched as if I'd slapped her. The anesthesiologist's eyes widened, and he took an involuntary step back. He was young, probably just a resident. He was in over his head, and he knew it. Dr. Huang, however, was a different story. He was a veteran of these gray market transactions. In my previous life, I remembered his reassuring smiles and his clinical detachment. Now, I saw the flicker of avarice and impatience in his eyes. He wasn't concerned for my well-being. He was concerned about his timeline. He glanced nervously at the large clock on the wall, then at his own wristwatch. A silent calculation. He knew the buyer, Mr. Song, was prepped and waiting. His own emergency surgery was scheduled, and the organ, my organ, was expected within the next 6 hours to ensure viability. A delay was a complication. A cancellation was a disaster. Miss Lin, Dr. Huang began, his voice a low, placating rumble. Your mother is right. You've had a strong sedative. Perhaps we should just lie back down, take a moment to compose ourselves. I'm not composing myself, I interrupted, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. I am getting up. With deliberate, measured movements, I swung my legs over the side of the table. The paper gown crinkled, feeling flimsy and absurd. My bare feet touched the cool, smooth floor. It was an electrifying sensation, a grounding. In my last life, the next time my feet had touched the floor after this moment, I was one kidney lighter, forever weakened. This time, I was whole. I stood up, ignoring the slight dizziness from the sedative and the sting in my hand. The blood had already started to clot, a dark, defiant smear against my skin. I stood there, a 20-year-old girl in a flimsy paper gown, facing down a surgeon, his team, and the woman who had birthed me in one life and planned to bury me in another. My small frame felt infused with the strength of a 43-year-old woman's fury. "I'm walking out of here," I said, my voice calm and even. I looked from Dr. Huang's anxious face to my mother's terrified one. "And you can't stop me. Legally, I'm an adult. I just withdrew my consent. If any of you try to touch me, it's assault. If you try to operate, it's aggravated battery and mutilation." The legal terms, so precise and jarring, hung in the air. I had spent countless sleepless nights on dialysis researching this, fantasizing about this very moment. I saw the flicker of understanding and fear in Dr. Huang's eyes. He was a man who understood risk, and the risk of a lawsuit and a career-ending scandal had just skyrocketed. My mother, however, wasn't thinking about legalities. She was thinking about 50,000 yuan slipping through her fingers. She was thinking about her bookie and the men he'd sent to her door. Desperation clawed its way back onto her face, replacing the shock. "Wei Wei, don't do this to me," she pleaded, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "We need the money. Think about our future." "Our future?" I let out another short, sharp laugh. "You mean your future, the one you were going to build on top of my grave." I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on all of them, on the silent nurses, the panicked anesthesiologist, the calculating surgeon, and my monstrous mother. I walked toward the door, each step firm and deliberate. The back of the gown was open, and I could feel their collective stares on my exposed skin. But I felt no shame, only power. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind a tableau of chaos and the splattered blood of my first decisive victory. 3 hours later, I was sitting in a sticky vinyl booth in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of lukewarm, bitter coffee. The place smelled of stale grease and floor cleaner, a nauseating combination that did little to soothe my frayed nerves. But it offered a perfect vantage point. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, I had a clear view of the emergency entrance and the manicured lawns beyond. I watched my mother, a tiny, frantic figure, pacing back and forth on the curb. Her phone was permanently attached to her ear, her free hand gesticulating wildly as she cycled through panic, rage, and wheedling desperation. She was calling her creditors, calling her mahjong partners, and most importantly, calling the man whose life was on a ticking clock. Right on cue, a sleek black Mercedes S-Class pulled up to the emergency entrance with a quiet purr that spoke of money and influence. The car was an old friend, a harbinger of doom I knew all too well. In my previous life, I had only heard about it. It was the car that belonged to the mysterious, wealthy benefactor. Now I watched as the back door opened and a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that couldn't quite hide his sickly pallor, emerged. Mr. Song. My heart gave a little thump, a drumbeat of anticipation. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter liquid a welcome jolt. I watched him say a few curt words to my mother, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. She pointed a trembling finger toward the cafeteria. He nodded, his face a grim mask, and started walking in my direction. The irony was a physical thing, a taste in the back of my throat like sour wine. I knew something about that expensive car that he didn't. 2 weeks from today, on a rain-slicked highway just outside the city, that very same Mercedes would be involved in a multi-car pileup. A truck carrying construction rebar would lose its load, and a piece of steel would shear through the driver's side of the Mercedes like a hot knife through butter. Mr. Song would be killed instantly. His desperate, illegal, life-altering purchase of my kidney would have been utterly, tragically pointless. He was a dead man, fighting for a life he wasn't going to have anyway. The glass doors of the cafeteria slid open, and he stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room for a moment before landing on me. There was no mistaking the lone girl in a stolen set of hospital scrubs sitting in the corner booth. He walked over, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the tiled floor, and slid into the seat across from me. Up close, his condition was even more apparent. The whites of his eyes were a disturbing shade of yellow, a classic sign of jaundice. His skin had a waxy, sallow tint that no amount of wealth could conceal. Advanced liver failure, I recalled from the whispers and gossip of my past life. His own organs were failing him, and he had assumed money could simply buy a replacement part, like swapping out a faulty engine in his fancy car. "Your mother says you're having second thoughts," he said. His voice was raspy, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. It was the voice of a man accustomed to getting his way. "I'm not having second thoughts," I replied, placing my coffee cup down with a steady hand. I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm having first thoughts, real thoughts, about what happens to daughters who give their mothers everything they have and get nothing but an early grave in return." A flicker of annoyance crossed his jaundiced face. He wasn't here to debate family ethics. He was here to close a deal. "She mentioned you might be difficult," he said, the word dripping with condescension. "She said you were emotional. That's why I came prepared. I brought some insurance." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a plain, brown manila envelope, sliding it across the grimy tabletop toward me. It landed with a soft thud. I knew what was inside. I could feel the ghost of them in my hands, the slick, glossy paper, the grainy images that had sealed my fate the first time around. "What is this?" I asked, playing my part. "Open it," he commanded. I slowly untucked the flap and slid out a small stack of photographs. They were stills from a security camera, time-stamped from last month. They showed me, clear as day, at the small accounting firm where I worked as a clerk. In one photo, I was at my desk after hours. In another, I was forging figures on a petty cash receipt. In the final one, I was slipping a small bundle of cash into my purse. The irony burned with the heat of a furnace. In my previous life, I had never stolen a single yuan. I was meticulously honest. But my mother, hounded by loan sharks, had come to me, sobbing, begging. She had spun a tale of a terrible misunderstanding, a bookkeeping error that she was being blamed for at her own part-time job. She said she'd be fired, maybe even arrested, if she couldn't replace the missing 2,000 yuan immediately. She coached me, told me exactly which accounts at my firm were rarely checked, which receipts would be easiest to alter. She swore she would pay it back before the monthly audit. I, the dutiful, idiotic daughter, had believed her. I had committed the crime for her, and she, in turn, had used my crime as leverage for her own gain. Mr. Song watched me, a confident, predatory smirk playing on his thin lips. "Your boss is a friend of a friend," he explained, as if speaking to a child. "He hasn't filed a police report yet. He's waiting to hear from me. Those photos, along with your mother's testimony, it's enough to send you to prison for at least 3 years. 3 years is a long time for a young girl like you." He thought he had me. He saw a scared, cornered 20-year-old with a criminal record hanging over her head. He saw leverage. He saw his new kidney. I didn't let any of my inner turmoil show. Instead, I leaned back in the booth, the cheap vinyl crinkling beneath me. I let my eyes drift over the photographs one more time, then I slowly, deliberately met his gaze. I studied his desperate, yellowed eyes, the faint tremor in his hands as he rested them on the table. I saw the shadow of death hanging over him. I remembered another piece of my past life's tapestry of tragedy. A few weeks after my surgery, after Mr. Song had my kidney, I'd overheard my mother talking on the phone. Mr. Song's body was rejecting the organ. It wasn't a perfect match after all. In his desperation, he had turned to his own family. He had a daughter, a little younger than me. He had begged her, pleaded with her, offered her millions for one of her kidneys. And she, a girl who had everything he had ever given her, had looked her dying father in the eye and refused him flat. The knowledge was my armor. The foreknowledge was my weapon. He thought he was the predator in this negotiation. He had no idea he was already prey, not to me, but to fate itself. And I was just a spectator with a front row seat. A slow smile spread across my face, a genuine, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. It seemed to unnerve Mr. Song more than any outburst of anger or tears would have. His confident smirk wavered, replaced by a sliver of uncertainty. He was a man who dealt in absolutes, in transactions, in leverage. He wasn't prepared for a variable he couldn't quantify. You can keep the photos, I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the small table with perfect clarity. I pushed the manila envelope back toward him. They're a good reminder of what happens when you trust the wrong people. His brow furrowed. This wasn't the reaction he expected. He expected pleading, bargaining, a reluctant capitulation. My calm defiance was a wrench in his carefully laid plans. "Don't be a fool, girl," he rasped, his voice losing its authoritative edge and gaining a hint of gravelly impatience. "You think you can walk away from this? You'll be in a cell by nightfall." "Maybe," I conceded with a small shrug. "But you'll be on a mortuary slab a lot sooner than you think. And so will your associate, Dr. Huang." I reached into the pocket of the scrubs I had borrowed and pulled out my cheap secondhand smartphone. It was an old model, but its most important function worked perfectly. I tapped the screen and a simple recording app filled the display. The timer on it read 10 minutes and 27 seconds. It had been running since before he even sat down. "I wonder," I said, tilting the screen so he could see the red, pulsing icon that indicated an active recording, "what the provincial medical board will think about a renowned surgeon like Dr. Huang conspiring with a patient to purchase an illegal organ. Or what the police will think about a wealthy businessman attempting to blackmail a young woman into coercive organ donation. Conspiracy charges carry a hefty sentence. Much longer than 3 years for petty theft, I'd imagine." The transformation was immediate and glorious. The last vestiges of his confident smirk crumbled, dissolving like sandcastles in a tide. The sickly yellow of his skin seemed to deepen, his face slackening with shock. His gaze flickered from my phone back to my eyes, and in them I saw the dawning horror of a man who has just walked into a perfectly laid trap. The weight of what I was implying, criminal conspiracy, medical malpractice, blackmail, settled over him like a burial shroud. He had come here holding a knife, thinking he was the butcher, only to find my hand was already on the hilt of a sword pointed at his own throat. "You're bluffing," he whispered, but the words had no conviction. They were the last gasp of a man drowning in his own desperation. "Am I?" I asked sweetly. "Dr. Huang's name has been mentioned several times. You explicitly stated your intention to use these photos to force me into surgery. You even named your price, or rather, my mother's price. 50,000 Wayne. It's all here." I patted the phone gently. A very compelling story for any prosecutor. He slumped back against the vinyl, a wave of dizziness seeming to wash over him. His breathing became shallow, wheezing. The predator was gone, replaced by a sick, terrified old man. He had played his only card, and I had not only called his bluff but raised the stakes to a level that would ruin him completely. In my mind, the clock of his life ticked down with brutal precision. 36 hours. That's all he had left. In my previous life, I knew from the post-mortem gossip that his condition had taken a sudden, sharp downturn a day and a half after my scheduled surgery time. Without a new kidney, his system would crash, his organs failing in a catastrophic cascade. He would become delirious, his body shutting down piece by piece. He would, in his final lucid moments, become desperate beyond all reason. He would contact my mother again, this time offering not 50,000 but 150,000 yuan. Triple the price. A last futile attempt to buy his way out of death's embrace. My mother would come to me, her eyes wild with a different kind of desperation, begging me to reconsider, to save the man's life and secure our fortune. And I would get to watch him die, knowing exactly what my answer would be. I would let the clock run out. But that was a pleasure to be savored later. That was the checkmate. Right now, I was still in the middle of the board, and there was another piece I needed to move. Another lesson that needed to be taught. Mr. Song's ruin was a satisfying side effect, but he was never my primary target. My gaze drifted past him, through the large windows to where my mother was still pacing, her phone call having clearly ended in failure. She looked lost, pathetic. A lifetime of using me, her only child, as a tool, a resource, a commodity, had left her completely unprepared for the moment her tool decided to fight back. She thought my body was her solution. She thought my love was her safety net. I stood up from the booth, leaving Mr. Song to stew in the toxic juices of his own fear and failing health. He didn't try to stop me. He just sat there, staring at the tabletop. A man already wrestling with his own ghost. I walked out of the cafeteria, my borrowed scrubs swishing around my ankles. The air outside was cool and fresh. I took a deep breath. It felt clean, pure. It was the air of a life reclaimed. My mother saw me approaching and her face lit up with a desperate, hopeful flicker. She thought perhaps that I had been reasoned with, that the deal was back on. "Wei Wei," she started, rushing toward me. I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "Don't," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "We're not done yet, not by a long shot." My real target was waiting. I needed to teach my mother, Chen Mei, what it feels like when the person you've used and manipulated your entire life suddenly becomes the one holding all the cards. Her lesson was just beginning. My next move had to be decisive, public, and utterly devastating. My mother's power over me had always been rooted in two things: my misplaced sense of filial duty and her carefully constructed image as a long-suffering, devoted parent. The first foundation had already crumbled. Now it was time to dynamite the second. I knew exactly where to find her. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, without fail, she was at the Lucky Phoenix Mahjong Parlor, a dingy, smoke-filled establishment tucked away in a back alley. It was her real church. The felt-topped tables her altars, the clacking tiles her prayer beads. It was where she went to boast about her dutiful daughter, to lament her fabricated misfortunes, and to gamble away money she didn't have. It was her stage, and I was about to hijack the performance. I walked out of the hospital, hailed a taxi, and went straight to my mother's cramped, musty apartment. I still had a key from my past life, and it worked like a charm. The place was a mess, as usual. Stacks of old newspapers, dirty dishes in the sink, the faint, sour smell of stale cigarettes. I went straight to her bedroom, to the bottom drawer of her dresser where she kept her important papers. Tucked away under a pile of old sweaters, I found what I was looking for: a thin folder containing her own medical records. In my first life, I'd found these by accident years after my surgery, and the discovery had been a quiet, sickening revelation. This time, it was a deliberate act of war. With her records in my bag, I took another taxi to the Lucky Phoenix. The moment I pushed through the beaded curtain at the entrance, a wall of noise and smoke hit me. The rhythmic, almost hypnotic clatter of mahjong tiles being shuffled and slammed down, the low hum of gossip, the thick haze of cigarette smoke hanging in the air like a permanent cloud. There she was at her usual corner table, surrounded by her coven of gossiping old crows, Auntie Sun, Mrs. Lee, and Auntie Zhang. They were her audience, her enablers. My mother was in the middle of a dramatic monologue, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. I could guess the topic: her ungrateful, confused daughter who had thrown a hysterical fit and jeopardized a life-saving procedure for a poor, dying man. I didn't hesitate. I strode across the room, my footsteps silent on the worn-out carpet. I walked right up to their table and, without a word, slammed the folder of medical records down onto the center of the table. The impact was like a thunderclap in the small room. Tiles jumped and scattered across the green felt, a few even skittering off the edge and clattering to the floor. The entire parlor went silent. Every eye turned to our table. My mother stared at the folder, then up at me, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning dread. "Ladies," I announced, my voice clear and carrying to every corner of the smoke-filled room. I picked up a single sheet of paper from the folder, a lab result from 6 months ago. "I find it so touching how you all listen to my mother's stories of woe, but did you know she has a few secrets of her own? Did you know that Chen Mei has stage 3 chronic kidney disease?" A collective gasp went through the room. Auntie Sun's jaw dropped, her cigarette dangling precariously from her lips. Mrs. Lee, who had been mid-shuffle, froze with her hands hovering over a pile of tiles. "It's hereditary," I continued, pressing my advantage, my voice laced with ice. "A genetic condition. That's why she was so desperate for a kidney. That's why she needed mine so badly." The shocked silence that followed was a physical blow more impactful than any shouting match could have been. Her gambling partners, the women who had lent her money and listened to her lies for years, stared at the damning lab results, then at my mother, their expressions shifting from sympathy to suspicion. "You lied to me," I said, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. I was speaking directly to her now, but I made sure everyone could hear. You lied to me for my entire life. 23 years. You let me believe I was donating a kidney to save some anonymous stranger out of the goodness of my heart. But you weren't saving a stranger, were you, Ma? You were saving yourself. My mother's hands began to shake violently. She reached for the scattered papers, her fingers fumbling as if they'd forgotten how to work. Wei, she whispered, her voice a pathetic, reedy thing. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I shot back, my voice rising again. I understand that you have a degenerative kidney disease. I understand that you knew, sooner or later, you would need a transplant. And I understand that you looked at me, your daughter, and saw a convenient, compatible spare part. You planned to let me get sick, to let me die slowly from renal failure while you lived on, comfortably and quietly, on my sacrifice. Tears finally welled in her eyes, but they were tears of panic, not remorse. That's not true, she cried, looking around at her friends for support, but finding only cold, judgmental stares. The doctors said you'd be fine with one kidney, they promised. They said a young person can live a full, healthy life. The doctors lied to make a profit, and you knew it was a lie, I countered, slamming my hand down on the table again, making the remaining tiles jump. That's why you never took me for a single follow-up appointment after the surgery in my nightmares. You never let me see a nephrologist. You told me the constant exhaustion was normal, that the swelling in my ankles was because I worked too hard. You didn't want a doctor to find out what you had done, to discover that my remaining kidney was already showing signs of strain. You were just running out the clock, hoping you'd get your new kidney before I completely fell apart. Through the grimy window of the parlor, I saw a flash of black paint and chrome. It was Mr. Song's Mercedes, speeding away from the hospital. He had probably spent the last hour making frantic calls, only to realize that every path led to a dead end. The doctor was implicated. The donor was unwilling. The evidence was on my phone. He had 34 hours left to live, and it was just now dawning on him that I, the difficult, emotional girl he had tried to blackmail, was his only hope. A hope he had just irrevocably extinguished. My mother followed my gaze, her eyes widening as she saw the car disappear. The last piece of her plan, her financial salvation, was driving away. She was left with nothing but her bad debts, her failing health, and a room full of people who now saw her for what she truly was, a liar and a monster. She looked back at me, her face a mask of utter desolation. The game had changed, and she had already lost. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of calculated moves and heightened tension. I didn't go back to my mother's apartment. I used the small amount of cash I had to get a room in a cheap motel across town, a place with anonymous doors and thin walls. I spent the night not sleeping, but rehearsing. I went over every detail, every piece of evidence, every lie she'd ever told me, honing my words into weapons. I also made one crucial phone call to a pro bono legal aid society, laying out the bare bones of the case. They were intrigued, to say the least. A young, hungry lawyer named Miss Fang told me she'd be at the hospital first thing in the morning. The call came around 9 a.m. It wasn't my mother, but Dr. Huang's secretary, her voice strained and overly formal. I was requested to attend a meeting in the main hospital boardroom at 11 a.m. to discuss the situation. They were trying to contain the fallout, to broker some kind of deal under the guise of a formal meeting. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived at 11 sharp, dressed not in stolen scrubs, but in a simple, professional-looking blouse and trousers I'd bought at a thrift store that morning. I wanted to look composed, credible. My lawyer, Miss Fang, a sharp woman in her late 20s with an air of fierce intelligence, was waiting for me in the lobby. We shook hands, a silent acknowledgement of the battle to come. When we walked into the boardroom, the tension was so thick you could taste it. It was a large, imposing room dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the grim faces of everyone present. At one end sat Dr. Huang, flanked by a stern-looking man who was clearly the hospital administrator and their own legal counsel. My mother was there, looking haggard and lost, a public defender assigned to her, sitting by her side with a look of profound resignation. And at the far end of the table, looking like a specter at the feast, was Mr. Song. He was no longer in his fine suit, but in a hospital gown and robe, slumped in a wheelchair with an IV drip attached to his arm. His skin was a shocking, deep yellow, his breathing shallow and ragged. Death was no longer a shadow hovering over him. It was a palpable presence in the room, sitting at his shoulder. His time was running out, faster than even I had anticipated. Miss Fang and I took our seats directly opposite my mother. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. The hospital administrator, a man named Director Chen, cleared his throat and began, his voice oozing a false sincerity. "Thank you all for coming. We are here today to find an amicable resolution to what is clearly a very distressing misunderstanding." My lawyer cut him off before he could finish. "Director Chen, my client is not here to discuss a misunderstanding. She is here as the victim of a coordinated criminal conspiracy to coerce her into surrendering an organ under false pretenses. Let's dispense with the pleasantries." The administrator's face tightened. The battle lines were drawn. He nodded to a man at the head of the table, the lead investigator from the hospital's medical ethics committee. The investigator, a grim-faced older man, fixed his gaze on my mother. "Mrs. Chen," he began, his voice a low, serious monotone. "The preliminary facts are troubling. You signed consent forms for your daughter's kidney donation. You stood to receive a substantial sum of money from the intended recipient, Mr. Song. And you did all of this while concealing your own documented, pre-existing genetic kidney disease. Is that correct?" My mother's lawyer, a weary-looking man who had clearly drawn the short straw, jumped to his feet. "Objection! My client was acting in what she believed was her daughter's best interest. She was protecting her daughter from unnecessary worry about her own health problems." "Your client was committing medical fraud," I interrupted, my voice ringing out, sharp and clear in the silent room. I reached into my bag and pulled out a new folder, a different one from the day before. I slid it across the polished mahogany table toward the lead investigator. It glided over the smooth surface and came to a stop directly in front of him. And that's not the biggest lie she told. He opened the folder. Inside was a single official-looking document. He read it, his eyebrows shooting up toward his hairline. He looked at me, then at my mother, then back at the document, a look of profound shock on his face. The room was dead silent. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic wheeze from Mr. Song's collapsing lungs. Everyone was looking at the investigator, waiting. "What is this?" Director Chen demanded, his voice tight with anxiety. The investigator looked up, his gaze finding mine. I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He cleared his throat. "This," he said, holding up the paper for all to see, "is the result of a DNA comparison test. One sample from Lin Wei and one from a DNA sample of Chen Mei's kept on file from a previous blood donation." He paused, letting the weight of the moment build. "According to this certified lab report, the probability of maternity is 0%. He let the paper fall back to the table. "We're not related," I announced into the stunning silence. The implications of those 4 words sank into the room like stones through water. A lifetime of my mother's narrative, of her sacrifices, of my filial debt, all vaporized in an instant. The entire premise of her manipulation was a lie. "I was adopted," I continued, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "And she never told me. She let me grow up believing I was her flesh and blood. She let me feel the guilt, the obligation. 23 years of guilt, thinking I owed her my body, my health, my very life, for the simple act of raising me. An act she was compensated for by the state, I've since learned." "That's impossible," my mother whispered, the words barely audible. But her face, her ash-gray, crumbling face, had already confessed the truth. The lie was too big, too fundamental to hide. It was over. Mr. Song let out a low, mournful groan. He slumped further into his wheelchair, the last glimmer of hope dying in his jaundiced eyes. His 50,000 ween hadn't just bought him a failed transaction. It had bought him nothing but a starring role in a criminal investigation and a guaranteed, agonizing death sentence. He had gambled on my mother's control over me, and they had both lost spectacularly. Dr. Huang looked like he was going to be physically sick. His career, his reputation, his freedom. It was all evaporating before his very eyes. He was no longer a respected surgeon. He was a co-conspirator in a grotesque plot built on a mountain of lies. I stood up, the chair scraping back slightly against the floor. I straightened the jacket of my cheap new blouse, feeling a surge of power that was dizzying in its intensity. I looked directly at my mother, at the woman who was not my mother, the stranger who had orchestrated my ruin. I delivered the words I had rehearsed in my mind for 2 decades through countless nights of pain and regret. "I'm pressing charges," I said, my voice resonating with the finality of a judge's gavel. "For attempted medical fraud, conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm, and for the fraudulent filing of adoption records to conceal my identity. I want her prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." And after I spoke, the boardroom descended into a quiet, bureaucratic chaos. Lawyers huddled, the administrator made frantic phone calls, and the ethics investigator formally took possession of all my evidence. My mother, Chen Mei, sat utterly still, a collapsed star of a woman, all her gravitational pull, all her manipulative energy gone. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. Her entire world, built on a foundation of deceit, had been leveled. As 2 uniformed officers quietly entered the room to escort her for formal questioning, I leaned over the table just close enough for her to hear my whisper. "The irony is, Ma," I murmured, the word ma tasting like ash in my mouth. "After all this, after everything you did to get a healthy kidney, you're going to need a transplant within 6 months. Your disease is progressing faster than you think. And with your rare blood type and the genetic markers of your illness, I'm probably the only compatible match you'll ever find." A flicker of something. Was it hope? Desperation? Sheer animal terror? Flashed in her dull eyes. It was the last, most exquisitely cruel twist of the knife. I had taken her freedom, her reputation, and her money. And now, I was dangling her life in front of her, a life that was now, solely and completely, in my hands to give or to withhold. I didn't offer a solution. I just stated the fact, a fact I knew from the bitter memories of my past life. Then, I turned and walked away, leaving her to marinate in that particular brand of hell. 6 months later, the world had changed. The case had become a local media sensation. The kidney deceit, they called it. Dr. Huang was stripped of his medical license and faced a slew of charges, his career in ruins. Mr. Song had died 2 days after the boardroom meeting, his wealth unable to buy him a single extra breath. And Chen Mei, convicted of fraud and conspiracy, was sentenced to 8 years in prison. But the justice system was, in a way, irrelevant. Karma, or whatever cosmic force had granted me this second chance, had a much more direct sentence to carry out. I visited her in the prison medical ward. It was a sterile, bleak place that smelled of disinfectant and despair. We were separated by a thick sheet of bulletproof glass, a telephone receiver, the only bridge between our 2 worlds. The change in her was staggering. The woman I had faced 6 months ago was a shadow of her former self, but the woman before me now was practically a ghost. She had lost at least 40 pounds, her prison uniform hanging off her skeletal frame. Her skin had that deep, unmistakable yellow-orange tint of end-stage renal failure. Her hands, resting limply on the counter in front of her, trembled constantly from the uremic toxins poisoning her blood. Her breathing was a constant, labored effort. The prison doctors, according to my lawyer, had given her weeks, maybe days left. The state-provided dialysis was barely keeping her alive, a temporary measure against an inevitable tide. I, on the other hand, was thriving. I had my own small apartment now, a job at a bookstore, and the quiet joy of a life lived without fear or obligation. I was healthy. I took long walks. I ate good food. I slept through the night. I felt the simple, profound strength that came from keeping both of my kidneys exactly where they belonged. She looked up as I entered the visitor's booth, her eyes dull and clouded. She saw me, and for a moment, the faintest glimmer of that desperate, animal hope I'd seen 6 months ago flickered again. She saw my healthy glow, the light in my eyes, the strength in my posture. She saw her only chance. I picked up the receiver. She fumbled with hers, her trembling fingers struggling to grip the plastic. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just looked at her. a specimen under glass. I placed my free hand flat against the cold, unyielding barrier separating us, a gesture of finality, not connection. I hope it was worth it, I whispered into the phone, my voice soft, almost gentle. I didn't wait for a reply. What could she possibly say? I placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting off the connection between us for the last time. I stood up, turned my back to the glass, and for the first time in 23 years of memory, in this life and the last, I walked away from her without looking back. I didn't need to. I already knew how the story ended. She dies alone,